The Force is light and full of shadows.
Before we dive in, check the link in the description if you want exclusive timelines, members-only videos you won't find on YouTube, all on our Patreon. The first sound was the click. Not the lightsaber, not the screaming, not the volcanic wind tearing across the black shores of Mustafar while his body burned and his lungs filled with ash, and his master walked away without looking back. The click. Pressurized, mechanical, final. It resonated through the bones of his skull the way a funeral bell resonates through stone, not heard so much as absorbed, traveled through the architecture of the body until it arrived somewhere behind the sternum and stopped moving. The mask had locked, the breathing apparatus engaged, and the sound that followed, that long, controlled mechanical inhale, was the first breath of a life that was not his. Hiss, kuh, hiss, kuh. Anakin Skywalker lay on a surgical table in the Empal Surekin Center and understood, with the absolute clarity of a man who has just lost everything including the ability to scream, that the sound would never stop. He did not know how long the surgery had taken. Time had moved strangely since Mustafar, in fragments, in bursts of agony that were more color than thought, red and white and the black of unconsciousness that came and went without mercy. He had felt them remove his ruined legs from the knee down and replace them with something heavier. He had felt them reconstruct the neural interface in what remained of his right arm. He had felt the suit's pressure plates press down against burned tissue, 17 distinct contact points across his torso, each one a small, precise catastrophe, and he had understood, on some level beneath rational thought, that this was not an accident. The suit was slightly too small. Deliberately, the pain was the point. Palpatine had not permitted anesthesia for the final assembly. Anakin had not permitted himself to beg. Now the mask was sealed, and the respirator breathed for him, and he lay very still on the surgical table, while the Force, what he could reach of it through the suit's constant electrical interference and the body's shrieking pain signals, told him he was alone in the room. Not entirely alone. His master was there. Standing near the door, Anakin thought, though the photoreceptors in the mask lenses were still calibrating, processing the blue-white antiseptic light of the room in a way that felt like looking through fogged transparisteel. There was a fractional delay in everything he saw, a slight wrongness at the edge of every image, as though the world had been subtly edited without his consent. He focused, found Palpatine's presence in the Force. It felt like depth water, cold, pressurized, dark in the specific way that deep things are dark. Not the absence of light, but the absence of any possibility of light. He had always felt this near his master, and had chosen for years not to examine it too closely. He examined it now. She is dead. The thought arrived without warning, the way the worst thoughts always do, fully formed, carrying their full weight, extending no mercy. Padmé was dead. He had seen her body on the medical table, had felt the moment her light went out in the Force, had felt the absence that followed rippling outward like a stone dropped into still water, the ripples reaching him here in this facility, in this body, in this mask, still reaching, still expanding, nothing stopping them. He had killed her. He had put his hands around her throat, and squeezed, and she had fallen, and she had never risen. The respirator breathed. Hiss, kuh, hiss, kuh. He was aware, in a distant way, that he should be destroyed by this, that the appropriate response to the totality of what he had lost, Padmé, the children she had been carrying, Obi-Wan, the Order, every version of himself that had ever been worth preserving, was a grief so complete it constituted its own kind of death. He had seen men broken by smaller losses than this. He had held his mother while she died, and the rage that followed had consumed an entire Tusken camp and left him hollow for weeks afterward. He did not feel hollow now. He felt something quieter and more dangerous than grief. He felt himself thinking. The thought arrived in stages, the way the best tactical assessments always did, not as inspiration but as construction. One verified premise laid against the next until the architecture was sound enough to bear weight. I remember everything. It was true. He had been in the suit for minutes, hours, long enough for the anesthesia to fully clear his system, long enough for the pain to declare its permanent residency, long enough to understand that what he was now was what he would be, and still his memory was intact. His mind was not broken. The Jedi training that had first taught him to center himself in chaos was still there, beneath the grief, beneath the rage, beneath the mechanical breathing that gave away nothing of what moved behind it. He remembered the Clone Wars, every battle, every death, every choice that had seemed, at the time, to be the only choice available. He remembered Ahsoka standing in front of him in the temple hallway, her eyes steady, her voice quieter than he'd expected, telling the council she was leaving. He remembered the council's faces. He remembered his own silence, which he had told himself was loyalty to the Order, and had known, even then, was something closer to cowardice. She had needed one person to stand, and he had remained seated, and she had walked out of the Order alone. He remembered Palpatine, every private conversation, every carefully placed doubt, every seed of resentment watered slowly, over years, until the garden it produced was this: a medical table in a windowless facility, a mask that could not express the face beneath it. He played me. The simplicity of it was almost elegant. A Sith Lord whose patience was measured in decades had identified a 9-year-old boy on a desert planet and had spent the next 13 years transforming him, one careful manipulation at a time, into the perfect weapon. The attachment vulnerabilities, the fear of loss, the desperate, consuming need to protect the people he loved, Palpatine had mapped all of it, catalogued it, and then, at precisely the right moment, had pointed it at the Jedi Order and said, "This is the only way to save her." And Anakin had believed him, because Anakin had wanted to believe him. Because the alternative, that Padmé would die, that all his power was meaningless against that one inevitable fact, had been, to the version of himself that had existed 3 days ago, completely unacceptable. He accepted it now. There was nothing else to do with it. The respirator breathed. Across the room, Palpatine moved. Anakin tracked him without turning his head, using the Force to map his master's position with the same instinctive precision he had once used to navigate asteroid fields. The Emperor approached the surgical table slowly, deliberately, the way a man approaches something he is confident he owns. Lord Vader, the name landed on him like a boot on a wound. He filed the sensation away and said nothing. "I know you can hear me." A pause. "I know you feel the suit, the discomfort. I want you to know that every element of your new form was chosen with great care." 17 contact points, Anakin thought, against burned tissue. Yes, chosen with great care. "You have much to mourn," Palpatine continued, and his voice held something that in a different man might have been kindness. "And much to learn. Your power, even now, even diminished by the physical limitations of your injuries, is extraordinary. You will serve the Empire well, my apprentice." Anakin lay still. The respirator breathed for him. The photoreceptors collected light, logged ambient temperature, overlaid his field of vision with a targeting reticule that had no current target. He was building a room inside himself. Not a metaphor. A technique. The Jedi called it a sanctuary. A mental construction, a space within the mind that Force-sensitive practitioners could retreat to when the external world became too loud or too damaging to process in real time. He had never been particularly skilled at it. His mind was not naturally still. It ran hot, generated noise, found the distance required for meditation difficult to sustain. He was finding it now. Behind the mask, behind the mechanical breathing, behind the pain of 17 contact points and ruined lungs, and a body that was no longer entirely his, he built the room. 4 walls, a floor, silence. And in the silence, very carefully, he began to do what Darth Vader had never been permitted to do. He began to plan. Not in the way he had planned as a general. The immediate tactical calculation, the battlefield geometry, the resource assessment, something slower, something that moved the way Palpatine moved, in years rather than seconds, in trajectories rather than attacks. He has a suit with flaws built in. I know the flaws. He has a listening system embedded in the helmet. I will assume it is always active. He believes he has broken me. I will not disabuse him of this. He believes Padmé is dead. She is dead. That part is real, and I will carry it, and I will not use it as fuel the way he wants me to, because the moment I do, the moment I let the grief become rage on his terms, I become exactly the weapon he designed. Ahsoka is alive. The thought surfaced without warning. He did not know why it arrived in that moment, only that it did, with the particular quality of a Force impression, something felt rather than reasoned, warm at the edges in a way that the rest of his current existence was not. Ashoka Tano had walked out of the Order and vanished into the galaxy, and she was alive, and she did not know what had happened, and she did not know what he had become. She will. Eventually, she will find out. What she does with that information, what either of us does, is a question I cannot answer from a surgical table in a sealed facility. But it is a question that did not exist yesterday. Yesterday I was burning. Today I am thinking. That is enough. That is something to work with. Palpatine was still speaking. Something about the restructuring of the Republic, the dawn of the Empire, the work that lay ahead. Anakin let the words flow past the mask, cataloged them without engaging with them, the way he had learned to let turbulence flow past a ship's hull rather than fighting it. He was still. The suit breathed. The room inside himself held its four walls and its silence. "You will be the most powerful instrument the galaxy has ever known," Palpatine said, and his voice contained, beneath the warmth, the absolute certainty of a man who has never been wrong about anything. Anakin Skywalker, in the architecture of the room he had built behind his ruined face, made his first decision in his new life. He would let Palpatine believe that, for exactly as long as it served him. The respirator breathed. Huss! Kuh! Huss! The room held. The Imperial Palace had 17,000 rooms. Anakin knew this the way he knew the thrust-to-weight ratio of an Eta, 2 Actis-class interceptor, or the tensile strength of Durasteel, not because he had studied it recently, but because knowledge, once acquired, did not leave him. He had walked these corridors as a Jedi Knight. He had attended Senate functions in the East Wing, stood in antechambers waiting for Palpatine's schedule to clear, navigated the bureaucratic architecture of the Republic's most important building with the polite patience of a man who would rather have been flying. The building had a different name now. He walked it differently now. The prosthetic legs were heavier than they needed to be by exactly the margin required to make every step a reminder. He had calculated the excess weight on the third day, somewhere between the first formal inspection of the Imperial Guard and the moment a junior aide had physically pressed himself against a corridor wall to avoid being in Vader's path, his face going the color of old chalk. 30% above optimal, heavy enough to slow him, heavy enough to make the familiar hallways feel like walking through shallow water. He walked anyway. Every morning, the same circuit, the same pace, the same mechanical rhythm. He was learning the suit. It had been 11 days since the mask locked. 11 days of mapping. Not the palace. He already knew the palace. He was mapping the suit itself, the way a pilot maps an unfamiliar ship before a combat deployment, cataloging not the intended specifications but the actual behavior, the gap between what a system was designed to do and what it did under operational conditions. That gap was where the truth lived. The respirator cycled at 14.3 inhales per minute under standard conditions. He had timed it against the chronometer display overlaid in the upper left of his visual field. One of the mask's more useful features, though useful was a word he used carefully now, because useful described everything Palpatine had given him. And everything Palpatine had given him was a collar with different hardware. The respirator rate climbed under physical exertion, climbed further under strong force use. He had tested this alone in his quarters, pushing telekinesis to the edge of what the suit allowed, which was considerable even through the pain. Even with 17 contact points pressing against burned tissue, and a portion of his force sensitivity perpetually occupied with the management of simple survival, the raw potential was still there. He could feel it the way a man with a broken hand can feel his own grip strength. Present, powerful, temporarily inaccessible in its fullest expression. Temporarily was doing significant work in that sentence. He let it. The listening system in the helmet was the most urgent variable. He had confirmed its existence on day 4 through a method that required no special tools, only patience and the Force. He had sat very still in his quarters and extended his senses into the helmet's internal electronics, feeling for current flows that had no functional justification. There were 3 microphones embedded in the helm's lining, 2 faced outward, standard audio capture for his environment, the third faced inward, toward him. It transmitted on a frequency he could not block without tools he did not yet have. This meant that every sound he made inside the helmet, every breath the respirator didn't account for, every word spoken in his quarters, every unconscious vocalization, was potentially Palpatine's property. He had adjusted his behavior accordingly. Not obviously, not in a way that would register as adjustment to a man watching for signs of rebellion. He simply became, inside his quarters, very quiet. He was always thinking. He was careful to ensure there was nothing in his behavior that looked like thinking. The corridor that led to Sublevel 9 of the Imperial Palace had been a maintenance access route. Under the Republic, it still was technically. The Empire had inherited the Republic's infrastructure, along with its institutions and its debts, and had not yet gotten around to reclassifying every hallway. It was the kind of administrative gap that persisted in large organizations, not an oversight, exactly, but a consequence of the difference between the pace of conquest and the pace of paperwork. The man Anakin was looking for worked in Sublevel 9. His name, in the Imperial Personnel Database, was Ren Kallax, former Republic Navy technical specialist, transferred to Imperial Palace maintenance upon the proclamation. His file was unremarkable. His security rating was standard. His work assignment was environmental systems for the palace's lower infrastructure, the ventilation networks, the recycled water processing, the power conduit junctions that kept 17,000 rooms lit and heated and functional. What the personnel database did not contain, because personnel databases did not record the things that mattered, was this. Ren Kallax had once been a mechanic in the GAR's Specialized Prosthetics Division. He had spent 4 years of the Clone Wars fitting and calibrating cybernetic limbs for clone troopers with injuries that the standard medical corps lacked the skill to address. He was, quietly and without any institutional recognition, one of the 12 best cybernetic technicians currently alive on Coruscant. Anakin had identified him on Day 7. He had found him the same way he had always found the people he needed, not through official channels, not through the Force in any dramatic sense, but through the specific quality of attention that had made him an exceptional pilot and a better general than the Council had ever fully acknowledged. He noticed things. He noticed on Day 6 that the ventilation output in his quarters ran 3 degrees cooler than the specification the environmental manifest listed. He noticed, on Day 7, that the conduit junction outside his quarters had been accessed at 0340 hours by a maintenance worker whose badge number corresponded to Sublevel 9's staff rotation. He had pulled the badge number. He had pulled the file. He had spent 4 hours reading between the lines of an unremarkable Imperial personnel record for the specific kind of unremarkableness that a man cultivates deliberately. Ren Kallax had been very, very careful to seem like nobody, which meant he was, almost certainly, somebody. Sublevel 9 smelled like recycled air and ozone, and the particular metallic warmth of active power conduits. The lighting was utilitarian, strips of white along the ceiling, no shadows engineered for ambiance, no concession to the human preference for warmth. It was a working space. It looked like what it was. Kallax was crouched beside an open conduit panel when Anakin turned the corner. The man was in his mid-40s, compact with the kind of hands that told a history, scarred across the knuckles in the pattern specific to work done in tight spaces, with tools that occasionally slipped. He had a diagnostic scanner in his left hand, and a second tool Anakin didn't immediately recognize in his right, though he cataloged its shape for later identification. He did not look up at the sound of the respirator. Most people looked up. Most people heard the respirator approaching from 30 meters, and had completed their physical reorientation in their attempt to appear unafraid before Vader rounded the corner. It was a consistent pattern, one of the first things he had mapped about his new existence. The way a changed landscape forces a traveler to rechart every route. Kallax did not look up. He finished what he was doing with the diagnostic scanner, made a notation on the datapad beside him, and then, slowly, without the flinch, turned and looked directly at the mask. "Lord Vader," he said. His voice was level. It was the levelness of a man who had decided in advance how he would behave in this moment, which meant he had anticipated this moment. "Good, Kallax." The vocoder rendered his voice in its flat, resonant monotone. No contractions, no vocal variance. He had been practicing this, not the absence of emotion, but the translation of emotion into a register the vocoder could not reveal. "You calibrated the ventilation output in my quarters 3 degrees below specification." Kallax held his gaze. The standard specification runs warm for someone in an enclosed suit with active thermal output. "I recalibrated for occupant comfort." "You did this without authorization." "I did it without filing a work order." "Yes." A pause. "Filing a work order would have required an explanation." "An explanation would have required me to note that the original specification seemed deliberately unsuited to the occupant's needs." Another pause, smaller. I thought that observation might be unwelcome in certain quarters. Anakin looked at him for a long moment. The targeting reticule in his visual field drifted across Calix's face and settled, indifferently, on the wall behind him. In the Force, the mechanic's presence was compact and controlled. Not a Force sensitive, but a man accustomed to managing his own fear. He had learned the difference. Fear managed was not the same as fear absent. Fear absent didn't exist, not in anyone worth speaking to. You worked in prosthetics, Anakin said. Gar division, clone casualties, Coruscant triage rotation, years 2 through 5 of the war. Something shifted in Calax's expression. Not surprise, exactly. More the expression of a man confirming a calculation he had already run. That's correct. The mobility restriction in the left shoulder assembly of this suit is 32% beyond what the injury profile requires. The leg prosthetics carry excess weight that serves no functional purpose. He let that sit for exactly 2 seconds. I want to know if you can identify the components responsible, without modifying them, Calix repeated. The modifications will come later. The identification comes first. Calix set the diagnostic scanner down on the conduit panel. He looked at Vader's left shoulder assembly with the focused, clinical attention of a man shifting from one kind of conversation into another, the kind he was actually trained for. That shoulder plate, he said slowly, uses a Series 7 joint assembly. Standard Series 7 allows a 160-degree arc overhead. He tilted his head slightly. I'd need to look at the actual unit to confirm, but a Series 7 with a modified resistance collar could restrict that to around 110. It would look identical from the outside. It is identical from the outside. Calix nodded, once. The nod of a man accepting the specific gravity of what he was being told without comment on the implications. That, more than anything else Anakin had observed in 11 days, was what made him useful. I work this corridor every third night, Calix said. 0300 to 0500. Environmental systems run a diagnostic cycle during that window. It generates enough ambient signal interference to make this section difficult to monitor remotely. He picked the diagnostic scanner back up and returned to the conduit panel, movements unhurried and routine. If someone wanted to discuss technical specifications, that would be the appropriate time. Anakin said nothing. He turned and walked back toward the corridor junction, the heavy prosthetics carrying him at the pace the suit allowed. Behind him, Calix made another notation on his datapad. The respirator breathed. The room inside Anakin's chest, the 4 walls, the floor, the careful silence, added one new piece of furniture. An ally. The first one. The Kyber crystal screamed. Not in sound. In the Force. A sustained, high-frequency anguish that pressed against the inside of Anakin's skull like a migraine with intention. Directed, specific, the distress signal of a living thing being asked to become something it was not built to be. He had been warned, in the abstract way that Jedi Masters warned Padawans about things they hoped would never become relevant, that Kyber crystals were not inert, that they were sensitive to Force energy, the way certain deep-ocean creatures were sensitive to pressure change. Not intelligent exactly, but aware, responsive, that the difference between a Jedi's blue or green blade and a Sith's red one was not a manufacturing specification, but a wound. A Kyber crystal bled red. It did not choose red. Red was what happened when something with the capacity for light was forced, through prolonged immersion in darkness, to become a conductor for pain. He understood that differently now than he had at 14. The chamber Palpatine had designated for this purpose was deep in the Imperial Palace's substructure, lower even than Sublevel 9, in a section that did not appear on the standard maintenance manifests and that Anakin suspected had been built specifically for Sith practice, rather than inherited from the Republic's architecture. The walls were dark stone, not the palace's standard durasteel composite. The floor was unfinished. There were no lighting strips, no ventilation output, no environmental system connections that Calix would ever be asked to service. The only light came from what Anakin held in his right hand, a Kyber crystal, white, roughly the size of his thumb, faceted in the natural geometry that Kyber grew in, not manufactured symmetry but the honest angles of something that had formed slowly, under pressure, over geological time. He had taken it from the Jedi Temple on the 3rd day, during the window between Palpatine's formal declaration of empire and the arrival of the first Imperial administrative teams. The temple had not yet been fully secured. He had walked its empty corridors in the suit for the first and only time. The respirators echo off the stone walls, the only sound in a building that had held 10,000 living presences, and had gone to the crystal storage vault and taken this one. He had not chosen it arbitrarily. In the Force, it had reached for him, warm, tentative, the way a hand reaches for something familiar in the dark. He had felt it through the suit's interference and through the body's pain, and through everything Palpatine had constructed to narrow his Force perception down to a manageable aperture. And he had picked it up and closed his fingers around it, and stood very still for a moment, that had no clean name in either the Jedi or Sith vocabulary. It had been 3 weeks since then. 3 weeks of carrying it in the internal compartment of the suit's left chest plate, pressed against the armor near enough to his heart that the Force warmth of it was a constant presence. Small, consistent, a candle in a room that was otherwise dark in every direction. Tonight he had to hurt it. Palpatine had been direct about the process, in the way that Palpatine was direct about things he considered technical rather than personal. A Sith's kyber crystal did not respond to request or meditation. It responded to dominance, to the application of sustained dark side pressure until the crystal's own Force resonance fractured and realigned around the will of its new master. The process was called bleeding. It was called that because that was what it looked like in the Force, a slow, dark suffusion, like ink spreading through water, the crystal's natural luminescence drowning in something heavier. "You will find it resists," Palpatine had said. "All kyber resists. The resistance is the point. What you must understand, Lord Vader, is that the crystal does not break. It transforms. And what it transforms into is a more honest reflection of what you are." Anakin had stood in front of his master and said nothing, and had thought, behind the mask, behind the room with the 4 walls, "What I am is not what you think I am." He had not said this. He knelt on the stone floor now, the crystal held between both hands, and extended his Force senses toward it with the careful precision of a man diffusing an explosive. Not because the crystal was dangerous, but because he needed to understand its current state before he changed it. It pulsed, slow, regular, the rhythm of something that had been still for a long time and was now aware of proximity to something large. "I know," he thought toward it, without particular expectation of communication. "I know what I'm about to do to you." The crystal's warmth shifted. It did not respond in language. It responded the way organic things respond to acknowledgement. A small, involuntary openness. A lessening of the braced quality he had felt in it since he'd taken it from the vault. He pressed. The dark side came when he called it, which was the part nobody who had not touched it could fully understand. It was not a struggle to access. It never had been. The struggle was directional, not generational. The dark side did not require coaxing. It required management. He had always been closer to it than the Council had wanted to acknowledge, closer to it than he had wanted to acknowledge. And now that the pretense was stripped away, he could feel the shape of it with a clarity that was almost useful. Almost. He pressed it into the crystal, and the crystal screamed. Not metaphorically this time. Not just in the Force. A sound emerged, thin, high below the threshold of normal human hearing, but not below his. The mask's audio receptors caught it. A resonance frequency produced by the crystal's internal structure resisting compression, the way a bridge resonates when the wind hits it at the wrong angle. He had felt that sound in his back teeth. He had felt it in the scarred tissue beneath the suit's contact points, which responded to it with a fresh pulse of pain that the suit did nothing to manage. He kept pressing. The white light began to change. At the edges, first, the facets nearest his fingers, where the Force contact was most direct, the luminescence dimming toward something darker, not red yet. A bruised quality, like the sky over Mustafar before the volcanic eruptions colored it orange. He watched it happen, and felt the crystal's distress climbing, and held the pressure steady and thought very carefully about what Palpatine believed was happening in this room. Palpatine believed his apprentice was kneeling on a stone floor, bleeding a kyber crystal in anger and grief, submitting fully to the dark side, becoming the weapon the suit was designed to house. Palpatine believed this because Anakin had given him no reason to believe otherwise. What was actually happening was different, more precise, and significantly more dangerous to his master than simple compliance. The technique had come to him not from Sith lore, but from the opposite direction entirely, from a memory of a lesson Obi-Wan had given him when he was 11 years old. In one of the early training sessions before Anakin had decided Obi-Wan's approach to the Force was too cautious and too slow, and had begun supplementing it with his own instinctive methods. Obi-Wan had been explaining containment, how a Jedi maintained their center in hostile Force environments, enemy presence, dark side nexuses, the psychic residue of mass death. He had said, "You do not fight the dark side, Anakin. You do not push back against it. You let it enter your perception, and then you do not become it. You remain distinct. That distinction is what protects you." Anakin had been 11 and had found this advice mystically unsatisfying. He was 22, and it was the only thing saving him. He was letting the dark side flow through him, into the crystal. He was not becoming it. He was using it the way he used the suit, as a tool with known flaws, operated with constant awareness of what it cost and what it concealed. The crystal was receiving darkness. Yes, the darkness was real. He had genuine access to it, genuine capacity for it, the grief of Padmé's death, and the rage of Palpatine's manipulation, and the cold specific fury of 17 contact points pressing against burned tissue. All of it was real. All of it was available, and he was channeling it honestly into the crystal, because he had no other fuel source for the process. But he was not surrendering to it. He was directing it. There was a difference. The difference was everything. The crystal's color deepened. The bruised quality resolved into something darker, a crimson that was not yet the flat, lightless red of a fully bled Sith crystal, but moving toward it. The screaming in the Force peaked, held, then changed in quality. The resistance didn't stop. It became something else. A different kind of tension, the way a muscle shifts from fighting a weight to holding it, not defeated, but reconfigured. He felt, very faintly through the darkness and the pain and the suit's interference, something that was not quite the crystal's distress. Something that was not quite hope. He could not hold it, could not examine it. The moment he reached toward it directly, it dissolved, the way a half-remembered dream dissolves on waking. But it had been there. He catalogued it the way he catalogued everything now, without visible reaction, with absolute internal precision. He opened his hands. The crystal lay in his palm. Red, mostly, crimson at the center, where the darkness was deepest. But at the tip of one facet, the point of the crystal that had been oriented upward throughout the process, farthest from direct contact, a filament of white remained, hairline thin, structurally invisible unless you were looking for it, unless you knew, unless you had felt the moment of not quite hope and understood what it marked. He closed his fingers around the crystal. He would build the lightsaber tomorrow. Palpatine would see a red blade. Palpatine would see exactly what he expected to see, confirmation of what he had built, evidence that the transformation was complete. The blade would be red. The blade would be mostly red. The room inside himself noted the distinction and filed it carefully away. He rose from the stone floor. The prosthetics carried his weight with their engineered heaviness, the familiar drag of a walking pace designed to humble. The crystal was warm against his palm, differently warm than it had been before, a warmth with more complexity to it, more history. He had hurt it to save it. He did not examine whether that logic applied only to the crystal. The respirator breathed him back toward the corridor. Hiss, kuh, hiss, kuh. Behind him the chamber stayed dark, and somewhere in the Force, vast, present, too large to be the crystal alone, something that had been watching the process with ancient patience, turned its attention elsewhere, apparently satisfied with what it had witnessed, or waiting to see what came next. The Grand Inquisitor had excellent posture. Anakin noticed this the way he noticed everything now. Catalogued it, filed it, cross-referenced it against everything else he had observed about the man in the 6 weeks since the Empire's formal inauguration. The posture was not natural. Natural posture was the posture of a body at ease with itself. The unconscious architecture of someone who had stopped thinking about how they occupied space. The Grand Inquisitor's posture was performed. Shoulders precisely placed. Chin at a specific angle. The stillness of someone who had decided at some formative moment that how he appeared in a room was a form of power he could not afford to waste. Anakin had known men like this. He had known women like this. He had learned over years of combat and politics and navigating the specific social ecosystem of the Jedi Order that performed posture was almost always compensation. The question was what it was compensating for. The answer, in the Grand Inquisitor's case, was not difficult to identify. He was afraid. The briefing room in the palace's eastern administrative wing had been configured, Anakin suspected, by the Grand Inquisitor himself. The table was long and deliberately unnecessary. There were only two of them in the room, himself and the Inquisitor, and a table that seated 20 was either a logistical error or a statement. The chairs were imperial standard, utilitarian, uncomfortable by specification. The Grand Inquisitor had chosen the chair at the far end of the table, which placed the maximum available distance between himself and the door where Vader had entered. He had arranged the room so that Vader would have to walk its full length to reach him. Anakin had walked its full length. He had not varied his pace. He had sat down in the chair directly to the Grand Inquisitor's left, not across the table, where the distance would have been maintained, but adjacent, close enough that the Inquisitor would have had to turn his head to avoid meeting the mask's gaze. The Grand Inquisitor had not flinched. He had redirected the flinch, compressed it into a small, controlled adjustment of his datapad's position on the table, and resumed his excellent posture. Good instincts, reasonable execution, not good enough. Lord Vader. The voice was measured, cadenced, precise. A man who had trained his voice the same way he had trained his posture. Thank you for attending this briefing. I know your schedule. You have 6 names, Anakin said. A pause. Brief. The duration of a man recalibrating. I have a list of 17 confirmed Force-sensitive fugitives currently active in the outer 6 names. The vocoder rendered it with identical flatness to every other word he had spoken since the mask sealed, which was the point. The other 11 are noise, sightings without verification, informant reports that contradict their own timestamps, 2 entries that are the same individual logged under different aliases by analysts who did not compare physical descriptions. He let that sit for a moment. I reviewed the list this morning. The 6 actionable names are Kanan Jarrus, Nari, former Jedi Padawan operating under the name. I am aware of my own intelligence file, Lord Vader. The Grand Inquisitor's voice had acquired a quality at its edges. Not quite heat. The temperature that precedes heat, Anakin stopped speaking. He waited. He had discovered in 6 weeks that waiting was a more precise instrument than almost anything else available to him. Palpatine waited. Palpatine had built an empire with patience as the primary construction material, and while Anakin had no intention of building anything that resembled what Palpatine had built, the tool itself was separable from the application. The Grand Inquisitor set the datapad down. The Inquisitorius operates under its own command structure. The Emperor has sanctioned our methods and our mandate. I welcome Lord Vader's oversight in an advisory capacity naturally. But the operational decisions, officially, Anakin said, the Inquisitorius reports to me. The Emperor has indicated, I have the documentation. He had not brought it physically. He did not need to bring it physically. The Grand Inquisitor knew what the documentation said. He had known before this meeting. The territorial positioning, the long table, the specific chair placement, the preamble about his own schedule, was not the behavior of a man who didn't know the formal command structure. It was the behavior of a man who knew it and was testing whether the person above him in that structure was paying attention. A reasonable test, an understandable one. Anakin did not fault him for it. He had failed it, but Anakin did not fault him for trying. The 6 names, Anakin continued. Jarrus is your highest priority. He is a former Padawan, trained to knighthood level before Order 66. He is more dangerous than your current operational profile suggests, and your most recent deployment, the team you sent to Lothal, was calibrated for a half-trained survivor, not a knight. That is why they came back with nothing. The Grand Inquisitor's jaw tightened. The adjustment was minimal, contained, the musculature of a face that had been disciplined against expression. But Anakin was watching from 30 centimeters away through photoreceptors that processed light at a level of granularity organic eyes didn't match. He caught it. The Lothal operation encountered unexpected variables. The Lothal operation encountered a competent Jedi, Anakin said. These are not the same thing as unexpected variables. A competent Jedi is the expected variable. It is the entire purpose of your organization's existence. He paused. You were a temple guard. Silence. Before your appointment, you served in the temple. You know what trained Jedi are capable of, because you stood next to them for years. He let that land. Which means the Lothal calibration error was not ignorance. It was something else. The Grand Inquisitor looked at him directly. The mask looked back, giving nothing, which was one of the few advantages of the mask Anakin had identified without reservation. It was an extraordinary tool for a conversation partner who needed to reveal nothing while observing everything. He almost appreciated it on the narrow technical level on which he was permitted to appreciate anything Palpatine had given him. "What would Lord Vader suggest it was?" the Grand Inquisitor said, and the sentence had no question mark in its delivery, which was itself a kind of information. "Pride," Anakin said. "You sent a team that would succeed dramatically rather than a team that would succeed quietly. There is a difference between an Inquisitor who eliminates a Jedi fugitive and an Inquisitor who eliminates a Jedi fugitive with witnesses and a report that demonstrates the Inquisitorius's necessity to the Emperor's continued attention." He watched the Grand Inquisitor's posture maintain itself through what appeared to be significant effort. "You are worried about your budget allocation for the next quarter." The silence that followed had a different quality than the previous ones. It had the quality of a man deciding whether to be offended or whether being offended would confirm the accusation. The Grand Inquisitor chose neither. He chose, instead, something that surprised Anakin slightly. He chose honesty. "The Emperor's attention is not a fixed resource," he said quietly. "The Inquisitorius is 6 months old. Our operational record exists entirely in reports that the Emperor reads when he reads them. Quiet successes in the Outer Rim do not keep you funded." Anakin nodded, once, slowly. "I understand." Another brief recalibration from the Grand Inquisitor. He had not expected to be understood. "I am not your enemy in this matter," Anakin said, which was true in the specific, technical sense that the Grand Inquisitor was not currently on any list Anakin was managing. The man was a tool of Palpatine's, yes. He was also, currently, a tool that could be redirected. Redirected tools accomplished things that benefited Anakin's longer strategic position, and longer strategic positions were the only positions worth maintaining. "Quiet successes in the Outer Rim are, in fact, what I need from you. Not because I am indifferent to your funding situation, but because dramatic inquisitorious operations generate attention that benefits no one." The Grand Inquisitor considered this. The Emperor values visible displays of imperial reach. The Emperor values results. Visibility is one mechanism for demonstrating results. It is not the only mechanism, and in the specific case of Jedi fugitives, it is frequently the least efficient one. He leaned forward, fractionally, enough to carry weight without being a physical gesture of aggression. "A dead Jedi who disappears quietly removes a threat and generates no martyrs. A dead Jedi found at the center of a dramatic scene with Imperial witnesses becomes a story. Stories move through the Outer Rim faster than your ships do. Stories recruit." The Grand Inquisitor was quiet for a moment. When he spoke, his voice had lost some of its performed quality. Not all of it, but some. "You have thought about this extensively." "I was a general," Anakin said, "for 3 years. Counterinsurgency is a different problem than engagement. It requires different metrics." He sat back. "Send one Inquisitor to Lothal. Not a team. One. Someone patient enough to track Jarrus's movement patterns before initiating contact. I want a behavioral profile before anyone ignites anything. And if the single Inquisitor encounters difficulty, then they extract. They do not escalate." He let the mask look at the Grand Inquisitor for a long moment. "I will know if they escalate." This, he understood, was the statement that would do the most work after he left the room. Not the command structure documentation, not the budget analysis, not even the accurate deconstruction of the Lothal failure, the reminder that Vader's awareness was not limited to what was formally reported to him. He did not know if this was true in every case. It was true in more cases than the Grand Inquisitor could comfortably verify, which was functionally the same thing. He stood. The prosthetics carried him toward the door at the pace the suit allowed, the same pace it always allowed. The same 30% excess weight drag that Calix had now confirmed extended to both leg assemblies. The modification mechanism identified the bypass still weeks away from implementation. Weeks. He had learned to think in weeks instead of days. It was progress of a specific, unglamorous kind. Lord Vader did not turn. "The briefing," the Grand Inquisitor said. "You said you reviewed the intelligence file this morning. The file was not transmitted to your terminal until—" A brief pause in which Anakin could hear the man checking his datapad. 40 minutes before this meeting. "Yes," Anakin said. "That is not sufficient time to identify the cross-referencing errors in the 11 lower priority files." "No," Anakin agreed. "It is not." He left the Grand Inquisitor with that. With the knowledge that Vader had either reviewed the file before it was officially sent to him, which implied access he should not have, or had processed its contents in a time frame that suggested something about the quality of attention he brought to documentation that most Imperial commanders delegated entirely. Either possibility was, Anakin judged, useful for the Grand Inquisitor to spend time considering. The corridor outside was empty, the respirator moved him through it, at the suit's designated pace, and the crystal in his chest plate held its complicated warmth, and the room inside him added a second piece of furniture. An arrangement. Not an alliance. An arrangement had fewer obligations and more utility, and utility was the currency he was currently able to afford. It would do. Hiss-kuh. Hiss-kuh. The Senate building still smelled like the Republic. Anakin noticed it the moment the shuttle ramp descended. Beneath the recycled air and the ozone of 1,000 active terminals, and the faint chemical signature of fresh Imperial signage being bonded over Republic crests, there was something older. Stone. Real stone, not composite. The particular mineral coolness of the original Senate Rotunda's foundation material, which had been laid 4,000 years ago and had absorbed 4,000 years of political consequence into its molecular structure. It smelled like deliberation, like the specific atmosphere of a place where words had been, for a very long time, the primary weapons. The Empire had not yet fully converted it into something else. He gave it a year. Senator Bail Organa of Alderaan was not a man who startled easily. Anakin had assessed this in the first 2 seconds of their previous encounters. The plural of encounter was doing significant work here, because their previous encounters had been in a completely different context, in a completely different political reality, in a version of this building where Anakin had worn different clothes, and carried a blue lightsaber and had been, formally and practically, on the same side as the man he was about to walk toward. That context no longer existed. What existed instead was this: the Senate's Eastern Conference Wing, a small delegation room used for informal meetings that did not require the full rotunda's ceremonial weight, and Bail Organa standing at a window overlooking the Coruscant skyline, with his hands clasped behind his back, wearing the expression of a man who has spent 8 weeks managing grief and rage and the specific terror of a person who knows something enormous and cannot tell anyone what it is. Anakin knew what he knew. He had known it since Mustafar, since before Mustafar if he was being precise, since the moment in the medical center when the droid had told him Padmé was gone, and something in the Force had clarified with the awful specificity of things that cannot be taken back. He had felt 2 small lights go out in the Force in the same moment, and had understood, with the part of him that still processed Force information at a level beneath grief or shock, that they had not gone out. They had moved. Bail Organa was the only person in the galaxy Anakin was certain knew where they had moved to. He entered the room, the door sealed behind him. Organa turned from the window with the controlled unhaste of a diplomat who had decided in advance not to give his emotional state to anyone who hadn't earned it. He looked at the mask. The mask looked back. "Lord Vader," Organa said. His voice was exactly what Anakin had expected. Steady, measured, carrying its freight of feeling in the subtext rather than the surface. The voice of a man who had been in political rooms his entire adult life and had learned to treat every room as political. Senator Organa, the vocoder, flat, precise. He pulled out the chair on the near side of the conference table and sat, which he had discovered, over weeks of observation tended to recalibrate the anxiety responses of people who were braced for him to remain standing. Standing Vader was a threat assessment. Seated Vader was a conversation which generated a different category of fear, one that required more cognitive bandwidth to manage, which was useful. Organa remained standing for a moment. Then he crossed to the opposite chair and sat. He did not arrange himself in the performed posture of the Grand Inquisitor. He sat the way he always sat, like a man who had long ago made his peace with occupying space, and had more important things to think about. Anakin had always respected that about him. He filed the respect away and continued. "The delegation of 2,000, he said. Your name was on it. Along with nearly 2,000 others, Organa said, all of whom expressed constitutional concerns about the Emergency Powers Act to the Chancellor. That was 8 weeks ago. The Chancellor is now the Emperor. The delegation is not a formal body, and I'm uncertain what bearing a petition from a dissolved political. I am not here about the petition." Organa waited. "I am here because you are the chair of the Alderaan Relief Committee, which oversees the distribution of humanitarian aid to 14 Outer Rim systems currently experiencing food shortage as a consequence of Clone Wars supply chain disruption. Anakin placed a datapad on the table between them. The Imperial Logistics Bureau has recommended rerouting 3 of those supply lines to support the new garrison deployments on Lothal, Gerrel, and Kaller. The recommendation is on the Emperor's desk. Organa looked at the datapad without touching it. And Lord Vader is telling me this because if the recommendation is approved without amendment, approximately 800,000 civilians across those 14 systems will enter critical food shortage within 90 days. He let the number sit. The garrison deployments can be supplied by an alternative route that adds 11 days to the transit time, but does not cannibalize the humanitarian lines. I have drafted the amendment. A long silence. Organa looked at the mask with the expression of a man recalculating something fundamental. Why? He said quietly. Would Lord Vader concern himself with civilian food supply in the Outer Rim? Because an empire that generates 800,000 starving civilians in its first 3 months is an empire that generates 800,000 reasons for an insurgency. He held Organa's gaze through the mask's photoreceptors. I am not sentimental, Senator. I am practical. Organa's hands, resting on the table, were very still. He was thinking at full capacity. Anakin could see it, the specific quality of attention of a man running multiple analyses simultaneously, testing what he was being told against everything he knew about the person telling it. The amendment would need a Senate sponsor to reach the Emperor's desk separately from the Bureau recommendation, Organa said, carefully. Otherwise, it's simply a dissenting note in the same file. You're asking me to sponsor it. I am informing you that it exists, and that the window for submission is 4 days. He stood, leaving the datapad on the table. What you do with that information is your decision. He moved toward the door. He had calculated this precisely. This was the moment where he left, where the conversation ended before Organa could ask the questions that were building behind his eyes. The careful and intelligent questions of a man who had known Anakin Skywalker and was looking at Darth Vader and finding the arithmetic wrong. Padmé. He stopped. The respirator breathed. Ska. He did not turn around. He stood with his back to Bail Organa, and the word hung in the sealed air of the conference room. And he managed the thing that lived in his chest when that name arrived unannounced by doing what he had been doing for 8 weeks. He took it into the room behind his face. He set it against the 4 walls. He looked at it directly and did not look away from it. She talked about you, Organa said. His voice had changed. The senatorial surface was still there, but beneath it something human and exhausted had come forward. In the last months, when things were, she talked about you the way people talk about problems they haven't found the solution to yet. Like the answer existed and she just needed more time. A pause. She never stopped believing there was a version of this that didn't end the way it ended. The mask gave nothing. Anakin stood very still and felt the weight of 17 contact points against burned tissue, and the weight of the prosthetics' engineered excess, and the weight of the name that Organa had just placed in the room, and he held all of it without moving because moving was not available to him. Not here, not now. Not in a conference room, in a Senate building, with the Empire 8 weeks old, and Palpatine's listening system potentially active in the helmet that hid his face. The children, he said. The word came out through the vocoder stripped of every inflection which he had not intended, which was the only evidence of what the word cost him. Organa's silence lasted 4 seconds. 5. The silence of a man making a decision about trust across an enormous and possibly fatal distance. Safe, he said finally, with the clipped care of someone who had decided the single word was all the territory he could afford to yield. Both of them. Safe. Something unknotted in the center of Anakin's chest. Below the crystal's warmth, below the contact points, constant pressure. Something structural, load-bearing, that had been rigid since the medical table released its grip on him. He did not let it show. The amendment, he said, 4 days. Lord Vader. Organa's voice had recovered its surface. If I were to sponsor this amendment, if I were to associate Alderaan with a position that runs counter to the Imperial Logistics Bureau's formal recommendation, I would need to be confident the sponsorship would not expose Alderaan to administrative repercussions that outweigh the humanitarian benefit. Alderaan is a founding member of the Senate, a major contributor to Republic war bonds, and a system with no strategic military value and no viable insurgent infrastructure, Anakin said. It is the last planet the Empire will choose as an example. He paused. One beat, the precise weight of a statement that contains more than its surface. "I will ensure it remains so." He left the room before Organa could respond. The corridor outside was broad and high-ceilinged, the Republic's architectural optimism preserved in stone that the Empire had not yet gotten around to lowering. Imperial officers moved through it in clusters, data cards and manifests, the administrative machinery of a new order learning the shape of the infrastructure it had inherited. None of them looked at him directly. He walked. The prosthetics carried him at the suit's designated pace. The crystal in his chest plate held its warmth. In the room inside himself, alongside the ally and the arrangement, he placed something that had no clean strategic label, and that he therefore filed under the only category that fit: Leia, Luke, both safe. The four walls of the room held the information with the specific care of something that could not be allowed to be found by anyone looking. 8 weeks old. The Empire. 8 weeks of careful silence, careful compliance, careful performance of exactly what Palpatine expected to see. And here, invisible in the administrative corridors of a building that still smelled like what it used to be, the first genuine crack in the architecture of the Emperor's certainty, a senator who would sponsor an amendment that would feed 800,000 people, and 800,000 people who would remember, in 3 months, that someone had interceded. Not Darth Vader. They would not know it was Darth Vader. That was the point. The respirator breathed him toward the shuttle. The twin lights, somewhere in the galaxy, burned on. He did not reach toward them in the Force. Not yet. Not here. The distance between knowing and touching was the only safe distance he currently possessed, and he would keep it for exactly as long as he needed to. But he knew, both safe, it was enough. The Imperial bureaucracy had a form for everything. Anakin had not fully appreciated this during the Clone Wars, when the Republic's administrative apparatus had existed primarily as background noise. The paperwork that happened between battles, the requisition forms that other people filed, the supply chain documentation that arrived on his desk and departed unsigned because there had always been something more urgent requiring his attention. He had existed, for 3 years, in the operational layer of the Republic's war machine, insulated from the procedural layer by rank and temperament, and a general institutional tolerance for the eccentricities of the general who kept winning. The Empire was different. The Empire loved its forms. He had spent 4 days last week approving garrison deployment authorizations, not reviewing them, approving them, which required his personal authentication code on each individual document, a process that took 11 seconds per form and which no one had thought to batch into a consolidated approval mechanism because the system had been designed by people who valued the appearance of thoroughness over its actual function. There were 217 forms. He had authenticated them in sequence, at 11 seconds each, and had spent the approximately 39 minutes of that process constructing, in the architecture of his mind, a complete operational plan for the restructuring of the Imperial supply chain routing system. Nobody had asked for the plan. He had built it anyway. It cost nothing to build things that might become useful. The form he needed today did not officially exist. The Imperial Outer Rim Territorial Administration occupied a wing of the palace that had previously housed the Republic's Colonial Affairs Office, a department so thoroughly mid-level in its function that the transition from Republic to Empire had involved little more than new letterhead and a new director who had the good political instincts to agree with everything the previous director had done and attribute it to Imperial vision. The current director was a man named Velis. He was 53 years old, broadly built in the way of someone who had once been physically active and had spent the subsequent 20 years behind a desk. And he had the deeply specific anxiety of a bureaucrat who has been told that Lord Vader is waiting to see him and has had 4 minutes to compose himself before the door opens. 4 minutes was not enough. Anakin had known this when he arrived 4 minutes early. Lord Vader. Velis stood behind his desk. He did not sit down. Sitting down would have required a decision about whether to invite Vader to sit, and that decision had clearly exceeded his available processing capacity. We are honored. The Outer Rim Territorial Administration is always. Please, how can the administration? I need a resource survey, Anakin said. Velis blinked. This was not what he had prepared for. He had prepared for something involving his department having failed in some catastrophic and career-ending way. A resource survey was so far beneath the threshold of catastrophe that he spent a visible moment recalibrating. Yes, Certainly, we conduct resource surveys routinely as part of the territorial administrative mandate. Which system? Tatooine. A different blink. The blink of a man receiving information that doesn't connect to any existing file in his mental organization. Tatooine, Lord Vader, Outer Rim, Arcanus Sector, Binary Star System, 3 moons. I know where Tatooine is, Velas said with the reflexive precision of a man whose entire professional identity rested on knowing where things were. Then he appeared to remember who he had said it to, and his color changed. That is, I apologize, of course. Tatooine. The survey would cover water table mapping, agricultural viability assessment, settlement population distribution. Anakin set a datapad on the desk, specifically the Jundland Wastes region and the moisture farming settlements in the Northern Hemisphere. I want the survey conducted by administrative staff, not military. Documentation of existing infrastructure, existing supply chains, existing medical access, current deficiencies. Velas looked at the datapad. He picked it up with the careful movements of a man handling something he didn't fully understand. He scrolled through the survey parameters Anakin had drafted. His expression moved through several phases. Confusion. The specific confusion of a bureaucrat encountering a request that is technically within his department's mandate, but entirely outside its normal scope, followed by the beginning of a question he was clearly uncertain whether to ask. Lord Vader, Tatooine is... The planet has no significant imperial resource value. The spice route proximity is managed through Kessel directly. There are no military installations, no... I am aware of what Tatooine does not have, Anakin said. The survey documents what it does have. Existing civilian population, existing infrastructure, baseline conditions. He let the vocoder's flat register carry what it always carried, the implication that the statement was complete and that supplementary questioning was an expenditure of time that had not been authorized. The results go directly to my office, not to the regional MOF, not to the logistics bureau. My office, Velas processed this. The processing was visible and not entirely comfortable, but to his credit, and Anakin noted the credit, filed it. The same way he filed everything. The man arrived at the appropriate professional conclusion without requiring additional prompting. A direct request from Lord Vader, going to Lord Vader's office, bypassing the regional MOF was not his problem. It was, in fact, aggressively not his problem. And the fastest way to make it someone else's problem was to execute the request. Of course, Velas said, I can have a survey team deployed within 10 days. 10 days, yes, absolutely. Anakin stood. Then, because the room contained something else he needed, and Velas was still holding the datapad with the expression of a man who had survived a storm and was tentatively assessing the damage, he said, The Outer Rim has 14 systems currently in food deficit. Your department filed a report on this in the 3rd week of the Imperial transition. We did, yes. Velas straightened slightly, the specific posture of a bureaucrat whose actual work has been acknowledged. The report recommended a convoy reallocation from. The recommendation was sound. It was filed incorrectly. He watched Velas's posture adjust again, this time in the direction of a man who has just been told his work was correct and his process was wrong, which was the precise combination most likely to generate attentive listening. It went through the Logistics Bureau's standard intake as a Tier 3 advisory. It should have been filed as a Tier 1 operational necessity, which would have required a response within 15 days rather than the Tier 3 standard of 90. He paused. You were unaware of the filing distinction. I was, Velas admitted carefully. I have forwarded the distinction to your department's procedural documentation. The convoy reallocation is being addressed through a separate mechanism. He moved toward the door. In the future, food deficit reports from the Outer Rim are Tier 1. Your department does not have authority to resolve them, but you have authority to ensure they are seen by people who do, in the correct time frame. He left. The corridor outside the Outer Rim Territorial Administration was busy in the low-level, purposeful way of corridors that connected departments rather than delivered anyone to anything important. People with data cards, people with manifests, the horizontal movement of an administrative machine that was, in its deep infrastructure, still largely the machine it had been under the Republic, staffed by the same people performing the same functions under different insignia. This was what Palpatine had not fully anticipated. Anakin suspected. Not the people. Palpatine had anticipated the people. had plans for the people, was in the process of replacing the most senior of them with loyalists. What he had not anticipated was the institutional memory those people carried, the knowledge of how things actually worked, as opposed to how they were formally specified to work. The gap between the org chart and the function, that gap was enormous in any large organization. In an organization the size of a galactic government, it was exploitable in ways that could run for years before anyone with the authority to identify them looked in the right direction. Anakin had identified 7 such gaps in 8 weeks. He was using 2 of them. The Tatooine survey was the third. The survey was not about Tatooine's resources. He had told Velas it was about resources because Velas needed a category to file it under, and resources was a category that generated no follow-up questions and no interagency notification requirements. But the survey parameters he had written, water table mapping, agricultural viability, settlement population distribution, medical access deficiencies in the Jundland Wastes region, were not the parameters of an Imperial resource assessment. They were the parameters of a welfare check. Owen Lars, Beru Lars, the moisture farm in the Northern Hemisphere he had visited only once as Anakin Skywalker, to bury his mother, standing at a grave in the desert, unable to look Owen in the eye. Leaving before the hospitality the Lars family offered could make him feel anything more than he could carry. He had found the farm again now, in the Force, the same way he found everything in the Force, by reaching toward the warmth and following it. He could not reach toward it now. The distance from Coruscant to Tatooine was too great for the connection he had, narrowed as it was by the suit's interference and the constant management of pain. And any direct force reaching toward that location, if Palpatine chose to probe him during the attempt, would illuminate exactly what he was reaching toward. He could not go to Tatooine. He could not send anyone to Tatooine who knew why they were going. He could send a survey team that had no idea why it was there, which would generate documentation of what the Lars homestead situation actually was, which would be filed in his office, which no one else had authorization to access. It was, he was aware, an absurdly complicated mechanism for answering a simple question. He had spent 3 days constructing it. He would spend several more waiting for it to execute. The version of himself that had existed before Mustafar would have found this approach insane, would have requisitioned a ship, flown it himself, landed in the desert, walked to the homestead door, and knocked on it. That version of himself was not available. This version worked with what the suit allowed, within the surveillance environment Palpatine had constructed, through mechanisms that generated no alerts and left no force signature, and looked, from every external angle, like routine Imperial administration. The prosthetics carried him toward the shuttle bay at the pace they always carried him. He was aware, without reaching for it, without illuminating it, of a small warm presence on a desert planet 39 parsecs away. Barely a flicker, a child's force signature, undeveloped, unconscious, like a candle in an enormous dark room visible only because the room was so dark and the candle was so honest in its small light. He did not reach toward it. He noted it, he held it in the room behind his face with the same care he held everything there, and he moved past it, and he kept moving. The respirator breathed. Hiss, kuh, hiss, kuh. 10 days for the survey. He had been waiting 8 weeks. 10 days was nothing. He was becoming, without having intended to, a patient man. He was not certain whether this was wisdom or something the suit had done to him. Whether the enforced slowness of the prosthetics and the enforced silence of the mask and the enforced stillness of a surveillance environment had simply worn the impatience out of him through repeated contact with its own futility. He decided it didn't matter which. The outcome was the same. The shuttle bay opened before him. The stars waited beyond it. Tatooine was out there, small and hot and unchanged, and on it, in the desert, a child lay under twin suns and had no idea he was being watched over by something that wore a monster's face. The ramp descended. Anakin walked up it. The station did not yet have a name. In the construction manifests it was DS-1, which was the kind of name that emerged from engineers who had been told to stop naming things and had complied with minimum possible creativity. In the conversations Anakin overheard in the corridors of Moff Tarkin's visiting office on Coruscant, it was called the Project, with a specific quality of lowercase reverence that told him everything about what Tarkin thought it would eventually become. He had been to the construction site twice in his official capacity as Supreme Commander. The first visit had been an inspection, formal, documented, attended by 3 senior engineers, and a Moff who clearly found Vader's presence preferable to the Emperor's, but was careful not to let this show. They had walked him through the primary power generation ring, the turbo laser emplacement frameworks, the docking bay infrastructure that was still in raw Durasteel skeleton form. The station was enormous in the way that numbers became enormous when they exceeded the mind's ability to generate a matching image. 160 kilometers in diameter, and every meter of that diameter was either built or being built around a weapons system that Anakin had understood. On first review of the technical specifications, was not a military installation. It was a political instrument. A military installation threatened. A military installation could be defeated by sufficient force, by sufficient ingenuity, by the particular dogged resourcefulness that insurgent movements had demonstrated across every war in recorded galactic history. A weapon that could destroy a planet did not threaten. It demonstrated once, against a target selected for maximum political impact, and after that, it did not need to demonstrate again. It only needed to exist. The threat of the second use was the entire mechanism. Palpatine was not building a weapon, he was building an argument. An argument so large and so irreversible that no one would be able to finish the counter-argument before the debate was already over. Anakin had reviewed the specifications on day 3 of his access. He had spent the following 12 days identifying what could be done about it. The second visit was unofficial. This was the significant distinction. The first visit had been logged, attended, documented in 3 separate administrative systems. The second visit existed in one system only. The shuttle flight recorder that logged his departure from Coruscant at 0340 and his return at 0812. A window of time during which Vader's schedule showed a 4-hour maintenance block for suit systems that Calix had indeed scheduled, and that had indeed occurred at the palace, where Calix had performed a second round of bypass assessments, while Anakin was, in fact, not present. The maintenance block was real. Calix had been there. The suit had been serviced, the data logs updated. If anyone checked, the suit's internal chronometer would show a 4-hour window of low-activity data, consistent with a man lying on a maintenance table having component assessments performed. Calix had not asked what the maintenance block was being used to cover. He had asked only one question, 3 weeks earlier, at 0340 in the Sublevel 9 corridor. How much lead time do you need for the next one? Anakin had told him 6 days. Calix had nodded and gone back to the conduit panel. DS-1's construction site occupied a fixed orbital position around Geonosis, which was both logical. Geonosis had existing droid foundry infrastructure that had been repurposed for component fabrication, and historically resonant in a way that Anakin assumed Palpatine appreciated. The first battle of the Clone Wars had begun on Geonosis. The weapon that was meant to make future wars unnecessary was being built in its orbit. Palpatine enjoyed that kind of symmetry. He had always enjoyed that kind of symmetry. Anakin had thought about this during the hyperspace transit, and had felt the cold, pressurized quality of the dark side that always accompanied thoughts of his master, and had set it aside. The station's outer hull at the current construction stage had 87 functional entry points, docking bays, maintenance airlocks, pressurized transfer conduits connecting the construction platform to the station's interior. Of these, 41 were actively monitored by sensor systems. 31 were monitored by personnel. 15 were monitored by neither, because the construction schedule had advanced faster than the security installation schedule. And the gap between the two was, again, the gap between how things were specified to work and how they actually worked. He had identified the 15 unmonitored entry points on the first visit by the simple method of noting which sections of the hull the escorting engineers avoided discussing. People avoided discussing the things they were embarrassed about. Embarrassment was a navigational tool. He entered through maintenance airlock 774 in the station's mid-aquarial ring at 0421. The primary power coupling for DS-1's superlaser was not at this stage of construction connected to anything. The superlaser itself was a framework, a targeting aperture and an energy focusing array, both present in skeletal form, neither operational. The power generation system was 40% complete. The Kyber crystal housing, the mechanism that would convert the station's reactor output into the focused, destructive beam that could crack a planetary crust, was present, installed, and waiting for the crystals that would eventually be harvested, bled, and calibrated. The crystals were not there yet. The housing was. Anakin stood in front of it for 3 minutes. The The suit's photoreceptors mapped it in the blue-white of the station's emergency lighting. The primary systems were offline in this section, another consequence of the gap between construction pace and infrastructure completion. He was a shape in the dark examining another shape in the dark, and the respirator was the only sound in a chamber that was otherwise the silence of something waiting to become what it had been designed to be. He had not come to destroy it. Destroying it now would accomplish nothing. The Emperor would rebuild it. The blueprints existed. The funding existed. The engineering teams existed. A destroyed DS-1 was a DS-1 that took 5 more years to complete, rather than 3, and 5 more years of construction was not a solution. He had come to introduce an error. Not a catastrophic error, not a flaw designed to make the weapon malfunction in a way that would be immediately detectable. A catastrophic flaw would be found during testing. It would be corrected. The people who found it would receive commendations, and the corrected version would be marginally more carefully reviewed, and the weapon would be marginally harder to disable later. What he introduced was a small error, a precise error, a modification to the power distribution relay junction in the superlaser's primary amplification shaft, not in the mechanism itself, which would be examined exhaustively, but in the secondary thermal exhaust interface that routed waste heat away from the amplification shaft during firing sequences. The exhaust system was, by its nature, the least interesting component of a superweapon. It was infrastructure. It handled heat. Its function was to not be the interesting part. He worked for 40 minutes. The modification was not a bomb. It was not a timer. It was not a device that could be found by sweeping the area with a scanner. It was a recalibration, a 1-degree adjustment to the exhaust port's directional angle, changing its orientation relative to the amplification shaft by a value that existed within the engineering tolerance range for construction variance, and would therefore not appear as an anomaly in any quality assessment. The effect of that 1 degree, at the moment the superlaser fired at full power, would be to redirect a fractional percentage of the shaft's thermal exhaust backward into the focusing array rather than outward. Not enough to prevent firing. Not enough to cause immediate system failure. Enough to create, in the specific fluid dynamics of the exhaust flow during a full power sequence, a resonance cascade in the shaft's internal structure, a chain reaction that would propagate through the array and reach the main reactor. A small ship could fly into the exhaust port. Torpedoes in the right hands, at the right angle, would complete the cascade. He had not yet identified whose hands. He had not yet identified the right ship. He had identified that the geometry was possible, because he had spent 8 weeks building things that might become useful, and this was the most important thing he had ever built. He closed the access panel. It sealed with the magnetic click of a construction-grade fitting, indistinguishable from the 200 other access panels in the chamber. He stood back and looked at it for a moment. The exhaust port was 20 meters above the chamber floor, set into the shaft wall, small enough that it would not appear on any external schematic as a significant structural feature. Small enough that the technical schematics distributed to construction teams would annotate it as thermal exhaust port, secondary array, diameter 2m, 2 meters, the width of a maintenance corridor, the width of a very small, very fast ship. He turned and walked back toward maintenance airlock 774. The Force moved with him in the way it had been moving since Mustafar, not freely, not with the unimpeded clarity he had felt as a knight, but present. Warm at the edges, in the specific way that meant he was not alone in the Force. The light side, which he had spent years neglecting and months learning to distinguish from the warmth of the crystal in his chest plate, was not gone. It was there. It had been there on the surgical table and on the stone floor, with the bleeding crystal, and in the conference room with Bail Organa, and in every moment of careful silence and deliberate patience. He had thought, on the first day, that surviving was enough. He had been wrong. Surviving was the foundation. What he built on it was the point. He reached the airlock, sealed it behind him. The shuttle was where he had left it, in the unmonitored dark of the station's unfinished equatorial ring, small against the enormous incomplete curve of the hull. He flew back toward Coruscant through the pre-dawn dark. The stars held their positions. The respirator breathed, hiss, ka, hiss, ka. Somewhere in the Force, very faint, warm in the way of something that had not yet grown into the size of what it would become, a boy on a desert planet slept under twin moons and dreamed of flying. He did not know yet that someone had left him a door. Palpatine summoned him at midnight, not 2300, not 0100. Midnight precisely, which was not an accident because nothing Palpatine did was an accident, and the choice of midnight for a summons was a specific communication, a demonstration that the Emperor's schedule was not organized around any human circadian preference, but around the pure logic of his own will, and that Vader's schedule was organized around the Emperor's, and that this hierarchy was to be legible in every interaction, including the timestamp of a summons message. Anakin had been awake. He was almost always awake. Sleep, in the suit, required a deliberate act of mental discipline that he had not yet fully systematized, and the nights were when the room inside himself got its most productive work done, when the palace's ambient noise dropped to its minimum, and the Force became slightly more accessible in the specific way that quieter environments allowed for slightly more careful listening. He used the nights. Palpatine's summons at midnight was, therefore, not an imposition on his sleep. It was an imposition on his planning, which was more significant, and which he filed without reaction. He arrived at the Emperor's private audience chamber at 0002. The 2-minute delay was deliberate, not long enough to register as defiance, long enough to register as a man who moved at the pace his prosthetics allowed and did not run for anyone. The chamber was lit the way Palpatine's private spaces were always lit, minimally, with the specific preference for shadow that characterized a man who had spent decades ensuring his face revealed nothing to anyone reading it from a normal social distance. 2 light sources, positioned to illuminate the throne, and nothing else. The rest of the room was dark in gradients, the furniture existing as shapes rather than objects, the space engineered to ensure that whoever entered it moved toward the light where Palpatine waited rather than orienting themselves independently. Anakin had been in this room 14 times since the suit sealed. He knew where every piece of furniture was. He walked directly to the appropriate distance from the throne and stopped and said nothing. This was correct protocol. Palpatine spoke first in his own chambers. Anakin had identified on the 3rd visit that deviating from this protocol, initiating speech before being addressed, produced a particular quality of stillness in his master that preceded the application of the kind of attention Anakin could not currently afford to attract. He waited. The respirator breathed. Hiss. Kuh. Hiss. Lord Vader, Palpatine said. His voice in the dark had the quality it always had in private settings. The grandfatherly warmth stripped back, not to coldness, but to something beneath warmth. Something that had learned warmth as a technique and occasionally forgot to apply it when the audience was controlled. You have been busy. The Imperial administration generates considerable demand on my time, Master. Yes. A pause. That was a full sentence. It does. Anakin held his position. In the Force, Palpatine's presence pressed against the edges of his awareness with the cold, pressurized quality of deep water, heavy, directional, probing at the perimeter rather than pushing through. He had felt this before. Palpatine performing a Force reading on someone who did not know they were being read. He knew, from the outside, what it looked like. He knew what it felt like from the inside because he had been on the receiving end of it 8 times in 14 visits, and he had spent the intervals between those visits constructing the surface that the probe encountered. He gave it exactly what it expected. The grief was real. He did not manufacture the grief. It was present, available, the bedrock of everything he had been managing since Mustafar, and he let it float to the surface of his Force signature in the proportions that a recently broken man would display. The anger was real. He let it surface too. Not all of it, not the cold, directed anger that had a shape and a target and a 19-year timeline, but the unfocused version, the anger of a man who had lost everything and was looking for somewhere to put it. He let Palpatine feel that. He had learned, across 14 visits, that the unfocused anger was the signature Palpatine most wanted to find. It confirmed the narrative. Broken man. Leashed weapon. Rage without direction. Waiting to be aimed. He gave his master the confirmation he was looking for, and kept everything else below the surface where the probe could not reach it. The Grand Inquisitor has filed an interesting report, Palpatine said. Anakin said nothing. He describes your involvement in the Inquisitorius's operational planning with some detail. Another pause. Not the pause of a man who had decided what to say and was timing it. He finds your approach methodical. He uses that word specifically. Methodical. He seems to intend it as a compliment, though I sense he is uncertain whether the compliment is welcome. The Lothal operation was inefficient, Anakin said. Inefficiency generates exposure. Exposure generates insurgent recruitment. I corrected the operational framework. You corrected it, Palpatine repeated, and the word had a quality in his master's mouth that it didn't have in ordinary usage. A slight emphasis, not heavy enough to be confrontational, heavy enough to be noted. The Grand Inquisitor has been corrected. Senator Organa's humanitarian amendment has been filed and approved. The Outer Rim Food Deficit Report has been reclassified and acted upon. The Imperial Logistics Bureau has adopted a new convoy routing system. A pause. You have been very productive, Lord Vader. The administration requires. Why? Palpatine said, and the single word landed with the precision of something that had been prepared well in advance. Are you surveying Tatooine? The respirator breathed. Hiss. Kuh. Hiss. Kuh. He had known this question was coming. He had known it since the moment he filed the survey request with Velis, and he had spent the intervening weeks building the answer with the same care he had spent building everything else. The answer had to be true enough to survive a Force reading. The answer had to be emotionally coherent for a man with Vader's visible history. The answer had to be the kind of answer that satisfied Palpatine's suspicion by feeding a different, more comfortable narrative. My mother died on Tatooine, he said. The silence that followed was different from the previous silences. During the war, he continued, his voice carrying through the vocoder at its standard flat register, which cost him more to maintain in this moment than it had cost him in any of the previous 14 visits. Tusken Raiders. I was unable to prevent it. I have, he allowed a fractional pause, the pause of a man selecting a word carefully in a way that was itself a form of revelation. Unresolved feelings about the location. The survey is a mechanism for managing them. A mechanism, Palpatine said. I am aware it is not rational. On the contrary, his master's voice had shifted. The warmth technique had been reapplied, smoothly the way it was applied when Palpatine identified an emotional vulnerability he recognized and wished to exploit. It is entirely understandable. The places where we have experienced profound loss retain a hold on us, Lord Vader. The desire to surveil, to monitor, to maintain some connection to what was taken, this is a very human response. A pause that was almost gentle, though I confess I am uncertain what you expect to find. Neither am I, Anakin said. This was true. He allowed Palpatine to feel that it was true. The truth of it, the genuine not knowing of whether the survey would find Owen Lars's homestead intact and functional, or damaged or abandoned, was emotionally available and emotionally real. And he gave it fully, letting it sit at the surface of his Force signature where the probe could read it. Palpatine was quiet for a moment. The boy, he said. Anakin's chest did not move. The respirator moved it for him. The 17 contact points pressed against burned tissue with their constant precise pressure, and he held the room inside himself, with everything he had, and gave the mask nothing, and let the grief at the surface do its work. I beg your pardon, Master. Your mother, there was a child, I believe. A stepbrother. The Lars family. The warmth in Palpatine's voice had acquired something beneath it. Not warmth at all at this depth, but the cold, pressurized quality that was his master's actual register, briefly visible beneath the surface technique. You are not seeking connection to your mother's memory. You are monitoring the Lars household. He let 3 seconds pass. Exactly 3. A child I have never met, he said, on a planet with no strategic value, living with moisture farmers. He let the vocoder carry a quality that was not quite contempt, and not quite dismissal, the quality of a man establishing distance from something he is, in fact, profoundly invested in. My mother married into the family before she died. I attended the burial and left. I have no relationship with them. Another pause. If there is a child, it is a stranger. The Force probe pressed harder. He felt it at the edges of his constructed surface, looking for the seam, the place where the performance and the reality failed to align. He gave it the grief. He gave it the anger. He gave it the genuine, complicated texture of a man whose relationship to Tatooine was, in fact, not simple. The slave childhood, the mother's death, the rage in the Tusken camp, all of it real, all of it available, all of it covering the specific warm light 39 parsecs away that he was not reaching toward, and was not thinking about and was not illuminating in any direction Palpatine could follow. Strangers, Palpatine said, softly, have a way of becoming significant. I will discontinue the survey if you prefer. The offer was the most important sentence he had spoken in the room. It was an offer he was prepared to lose. He had the survey results already. They had arrived 4 days ago. He had read them and memorized them, and the datapad was gone. And offering to lose it gave Palpatine the sensation of control that was, in the end, the only currency his master truly valued. A long silence. "No," Palpatine said finally. "Let it continue. The Outer Rim's civilian infrastructure is a legitimate administrative concern." He paused. "I am glad you find mechanisms for your grief, Lord Vader. A man who cannot manage his own darkness is a man who cannot manage his power." He walked back through the dark chamber toward the door, and the force behind him carried the cold, pressurized quality of his master watching the way a man watches something he has not yet decided how to classify. In the corridor, alone, the respirator breathing its constant metered rhythm, he allowed himself the precise amount of relief the situation warranted. Not much. Palpatine was suspicious. Suspicion was not knowledge. Suspicion was a gap between what a man expected and what he observed, and gaps could be managed, could be filled with carefully selected truth, could be maintained at a sustainable level for exactly as long as necessary. He had bought time. Time was the only thing he was currently manufacturing at sufficient scale. The crystal in his chest plate held its warmth. The room held its four walls. Hiss, ka. Hiss, ka. Somewhere in a quiet house on Alderaan, a girl argued with her tutors in her sleep. He did not reach toward her. He kept walking. 19 years is a long time to hold a door open. Anakin did not think of it in those terms, during the years themselves. During the years he thought of it in the only terms available to a man, operating inside a surveillance environment with a patient and brilliant enemy 14 meters above him in the organizational hierarchy. He thought of it as maintenance. The door required maintenance. The way the bypass modifications Calix had installed required maintenance, the way the room inside himself required maintenance. Regularly, carefully, without visible effort. The work of preservation disguised as the absence of work. The door was a network, not a formal network. Formal networks had membership lists and communication protocols and meeting schedules, and all of those things were findable by a sufficiently motivated Imperial intelligence apparatus. And the Imperial intelligence apparatus had become, over 19 years, very motivated indeed. What he had built instead was a series of bilateral relationships, each one unknown to all the others, each one maintained through mechanisms so embedded in legitimate Imperial administration that dismantling them would have required dismantling the administration itself. Calix, who had become over 19 years, not merely an ally, but the closest thing to a trusted engineer Anakin had ever worked with, had trained 6 people. None of them knew who had commissioned the training. They knew only that they had been identified by a mid-level Imperial technical administrator as candidates for advanced prosthetics work, that the training had come with a salary supplement and no formal explanation, and that the work they subsequently did, in medical facilities across 4 sectors, servicing Imperial personnel with cybernetic injuries, had been quietly, consistently excellent. Bail Organa had died on Alderaan. Anakin had felt it happen. 19 years ago, he had sat in a conference room with Organa and read the specific fear of a man who knew too much, and he had told him Alderaan would be protected, and he had meant it, and he had failed. The Death Star had been completed 7 months ago, and the Emperor had used it, and Bail Organa and 2 billion other people were gone. And the cold, pressurized quality of the dark side had flooded Anakin's force perception for 3 days afterward, with a completeness that reminded him of Mustafar. He had not stopped. He had not been able to stop because stopping was the option that made every death mean nothing, that made the 19 years of careful construction mean nothing, and the version of himself that existed now, scarred, mechanical, slower than he should have been, and more patient than he had ever expected to become, had no capacity for nihilism. He had looked at it directly in the first weeks after the suit sealed, had examined it the way he examined everything, and had found it hollow. Nihilism was the philosophy of a man who had run out of things to protect. He had not run out. He had 2. The Rebel Alliance's existence was not a secret Anakin had maintained for 19 years, so much as an outcome he had cultivated without appearing to cultivate it. The food deficit interventions, the bureaucratic reclassifications, the 17 instances across 19 years where Imperial administrative decisions that would have generated maximum civilian resentment had been quietly modified. Through procedural redirection, through the judicious application of Vader's authority in contexts too minor to attract Palpatine's attention, into decisions that generated only ordinary civilian resentment. Ordinary civilian resentment did not produce rebellion. Extraordinary civilian resentment did. He had kept the resentment ordinary in 14 systems, and watched those systems remain politically manageable. He had tracked, through the intelligence reports that crossed his desk as Supreme Commander, which systems had escaped his management, and had noted, without surprise, that those systems were disproportionately represented in the rebellion's growing membership. He had known, from the moment Bail Organa told him both children were safe, that the rebellion would find them eventually, that the children, when they were old enough, would find a rebellion. He had known Luke's Force sensitivity from the survey results he had memorized 19 years ago, had tracked it in the Force across the decades as it grew from a candle to something brighter, had felt the moment of its ignition weeks ago, like a clean note struck in a room that had been holding only discordant frequencies. Someone had trained him. He did not know who. The warmth of the Force sensitivity felt different now, shaped, directed, the way a river feels different once it has been given banks. He had not reached toward it. He was reaching toward it now. The communication was routed through 6 relay points, each one a legitimate Imperial administrative terminal, each one accessed through credentials that had been maintained for exactly this purpose across years of careful infrastructure work. The final relay deposited it into a Rebel Alliance communication node that Anakin had identified 4 months ago through the straightforward method of following the financial trail of a sympathetic senator whose expense reports contained a category labeled constituency outreach that was occurring on planets where the senator had no constituency. People who were funding a rebellion and managing their own administrative costs tended to make small errors. Small errors were navigational tools. He composed the message in his quarters at 0300. In the silence that the palace's ambient noise dropped to, with the helmet's microphone system running at its baseline passive capture level, always assumed active, always managed accordingly. The message contained no sensitive information. It contained a set of coordinates for a derelict Imperial listening post in the Outer Rim that had been officially decommissioned 2 years ago, and unofficially maintained by a technician on Kallax's extended network. It contained a time window. It contained a single authenticating phrase that would mean nothing to Imperial Signals Intelligence, and would mean, to the specific person he had spent 4 months determining was the Rebel Alliance's primary intelligence coordinator, that the communication came from a source with legitimate access to Imperial command infrastructure. He sent it and waited. The reply came in 11 days. It came back through the same relay chain, stripped of any identifying information about its origin, which told him the intelligence coordinator was competent. It contained one word: confirmed. The listening post was a 4-hour flight from Coruscant. He filed the departure as a standard inspection visit to a regional garrison, which was the kind of filing that generated no follow-up questions, because regional garrison inspections were both common and uniformly tedious. And the administrative staff who processed his flight manifests had learned across 19 years to log them without curiosity. Kallax had performed suit maintenance 2 days before departure. The shoulder assembly now permitted a 158-degree arc overhead, which was not the full range of an uninjured body, but was 48 degrees more than the deliberate restriction, and the excess weight in both leg prosthetics had been reduced by 22%, over 14 incremental adjustments across 19 years, each adjustment small enough to fall within the tolerance range for component wear. He moved differently now than he had on day 11, not freely, not without pain, differently. The listening post occupied a small moon in an unremarkable system. The structure itself was 40 meters of durasteel cylinder, functional and charmless, built for signal capture rather than habitation. Now home to 3 rebel operatives who had been there for 6 days, and whose force presences he read from the shuttle as compact and controlled and very, very tense. He landed. He descended the ramp alone. He walked toward the post's entrance at the pace the suit allowed. The door opened before he reached it. The young man in the doorway was 19 years old and built like a pilot, compact, efficient, with the particular quality of physical confidence that came from spending years in situations where physical confidence was the difference between alive and not alive. His force presence was the one Anakin had been tracking for 19 years. Was the note struck clean weeks ago? Was the candle grown into something that was no longer a candle? He had his mother's face and Anakin's eyes. He was looking at the mask with the expression of someone who had been told something extraordinary and had decided to believe it, but had not yet had the chance to test the belief against reality. "Luke Skywalker," Anakin said through the vocoder. Luke held his ground. His hand was not on his lightsaber, which was the correct decision. "You're Vader." "Yes." "We sent the communication." "Yes." A pause in which Luke appeared to be performing the same assessment that Anakin was performing, reading what the Force said about the person in front of him against what his briefing materials had told him to expect, looking for the alignment or the gap. "The briefing said you were a potential asset," Luke said. "It didn't say—" He stopped. His jaw tightened fractionally, a muscular adjustment that Anakin recognized with the recognition of something seen in a different mirror. "It didn't tell me who you were." "No," Anakin agreed. "It would not have." "Are you—" Luke stopped again. The Force between them was doing something that had no clean name in either Jedi or Sith vocabulary. A resonance, a recognition, the specific quality of two Force signatures that shared fundamental architecture encountering each other at close range. Anakin had felt it once before, on Coruscant, years ago, with a 9-year-old boy in a Senate corridor, for exactly 1 second before he had understood what it was, and closed the connection and walked away. He did not close it now. "I have information," Anakin said, "about the Death Star's primary weapons system. A structural flaw in the thermal exhaust relay, specific coordinates, dimensions, and the precise torpedo trajectory required to initiate a reactor cascade." He reached into the suit's internal compartment and produced a data chip. Small, standard Imperial format, 18 years in the chest plate alongside the crystal. "This is not a trap. I cannot prove that to you. I can tell you that the flaw is real, and that you will be able to verify it against whatever technical schematics the Alliance has acquired." Luke looked at the data chip, then at the mask. "Why?" he said. The question was genuine. It deserved a genuine answer. "Because I built the flaw into the station 18 years ago," Anakin said, "and I have spent 18 years ensuring that someone would be in a position to use it. That required the Alliance to survive, which required certain interventions in Imperial administration that are documented in the second file on that chip." He paused. "And because the Empire should not exist. And because destroying it requires more than a structural flaw, it requires a pilot who can fly proton torpedoes into a 2-meter exhaust port at combat speed, while every defensive gun on the station is aimed at them." Luke looked at him steadily. "You know who I am." The mask gave nothing. The respirator breathed. The crystal in the chest plate held its warmth, and for the first time in 19 years, Anakin allowed that warmth to exist in the Force at the surface level, rather than below it. Allowed it to be present and readable and exactly what it was. Luke's expression changed. The assessment had completed. The gap between the briefing materials and reality had been measured, and the measurement had produced, in the young man's face, something that was not certainty. Certainty wasn't available yet, possibly wouldn't be for a long time, but was the specific quality of a decision made in the absence of certainty. He took the data chip. "The exhaust port," he said. 2 meters. 1 pass," Anakin said, "at the right angle." With the targeting computer off, Luke's eyes narrowed slightly. "Off." "Trust the Force," Anakin said, and the words tasted in his chest like something retrieved from a very long distance. "You will know when." He turned back toward the shuttle. Behind him, in the Force, Luke's presence burned with the clean brightness of something that had been trained by someone who had known what they were doing. And underneath the training was the raw material, was the bloodline, was the potential that Anakin had felt from 39 parsecs away when the boy was 10 years old, and lying on a roof, watching twin suns set. He had not reached toward it then. He reached toward it now, briefly, in the Force, not to communicate, not to reveal, simply to acknowledge. The way a hand acknowledges warmth from a distance, without requiring contact. In the listening post doorway, Luke went very still. He had felt it. He didn't know yet what it meant. Anakin walked up the shuttle ramp and sealed it behind him, and sat in the pilot's seat and placed both hands on the controls and breathed through the suit that breathed for him. And the crystal in his chest plate was warm in the way it had been warm since the stone floor, in the way that was not entirely the crystal. Hiss, k, hiss, k. The shuttle lifted from the moon's surface below him. Luke Skywalker stood outside the listening post and watched it go. data chip in hand, and the force between them stretched and stretched and did not break. He felt the Death Star die. Not the explosion. The explosion came later, the physical fact of it traveling outward at the speed of light. A new star briefly inhabiting the space near Yavin that would fade within hours and leave nothing behind but an expanding debris field and the particular silence of something enormous becoming absent. What he felt was the moment before the explosion, the moment proton torpedoes entered a 2-meter exhaust port at the precise angle he had calculated 18 years ago on a dark construction deck above Geonosis, and found the relay junction he had recalibrated by 1 degree and initiated the cascade he had designed to be initiated. He felt it through the force as a warmth so sudden and complete it took his breath away, which was a thing that could not happen, physiologically, because the suit breathed for him, but the sensation was accurate regardless. Something that had been pressing against the galaxy for 19 years released. The cold pressurized quality of the dark side did not disappear, but something in its architecture shifted, the way a load-bearing wall shifts when a structure it has been supporting is finally removed. Palpatine felt it too. Anakin was in the Emperor's private audience chamber when it happened. He had requested the audience 6 hours before the Battle of Yavin, through normal channels, citing an intelligence matter requiring the Emperor's personal attention. This was not unusual. He had cited intelligence matters requiring personal attention 11 times in 19 years, and each time the intelligence had been genuine and the matter had been real, because the access the request generated was too valuable to compromise with false pretenses. Palpatine had granted it, as he always granted it, because Vader's intelligence had always proven accurate, and because a Sith Master who refused information from his most capable asset was a Sith Master who had begun to confuse pride with strategy. The audience was scheduled for 2300. The Death Star had been destroyed at 2247. Anakin had been in the anteroom, waiting, when he felt it. He had stood very still in the anteroom for 43 seconds while the Force reorganized itself around the absence of the station, while the darkness shifted its weight, while somewhere in the vicinity of Yavin, a pilot pulled out of a targeting run and trusted what he felt instead of what the instruments told him. Then the door to the audience chamber had opened, and he had walked through it, and Palpatine had been standing at the center of the room rather than seated on the throne, which was the first time in 19 years Anakin had seen his master standing when he entered. The yellow eyes were incandescent. "The station," Palpatine said. His voice had abandoned all of its surface techniques. What remained was the true register, ancient, cold, furious in the absolute way of something that has not experienced thwarted expectation in decades and has therefore lost the tolerance for it. One fighter, one pass, a thermal exhaust flaw that should not have existed. A construction variance, Anakin said, within engineering tolerance. The quality assessment teams do not. The 2 words arrived with force pressure behind them. Not an attack, not yet, but the preliminary of one, the probe that preceded engagement, the Sith equivalent of a weapon clearing its holster. Do not perform administrative indifference at me, Lord Vader. I have spent 40 years reading men. I know what I am looking at. The room held its 4 walls. 19 years of maintenance. 19 years of giving Palpatine exactly what he expected to find. At the surface level, while everything that mattered operated below. The grief reel, the anger reel, the broken weapon authentic in its presentation. The surface had held because he had never let it become a performance. It was real. It was genuine. It simply was not complete. He let it drop now. Not all at once. Gradually, the way a tide retreats, first the outermost layer, the managed grief and the directed rage, pulling back to reveal what had been beneath it for 19 years. The patience, the construction, the 19 years of bilateral relationships and bureaucratic interventions, and one specific conversation with one specific senator in a conference room that smelled like the Republic. He watched Palpatine's face as the reading completed. He had always wanted to see what genuine surprise looked like on his master's face. It was less satisfying than he had anticipated. The surprise moved through Palpatine's expression too quickly, replaced almost immediately by the calculation that was the Emperor's default response to any new information, regardless of its nature. The man was extraordinary at adaptation. He had always been extraordinary at adaptation. It was, in the end, not enough. "How long?" Palpatine said. 19 years, Anakin said. "Since the surgical table. Since the mask. Not a question. His master was reconstructing, retracing, applying 19 years of observed interactions against the revised understanding of who had been behind the mask during all of them. The Grand Inquisitor's corrected operations, the food deficit reclassifications, the Tatooine survey, the humanitarian amendment Organa had sponsored. You were never— No, Anakin said. I was never what you built. The Force lightning came without further preamble. It came the way it always came, instantaneously, without the muscular telegraphing that organic combat produced, erupting from Palpatine's hands in both directions simultaneously, filling the space between them with blue-white electromagnetic fury that the suit's systems registered as a critical threat across 14 separate warning indicators in Anakin's visual field. He caught it, both hands extended. The bypass modifications Callix had installed across 19 years, allowing a full overhead arc that the original suit had been designed to prevent. He caught the lightning the way he had caught Count Dooku's lightning in a body that no longer existed, and the difference between this body and that one was the difference between a sponge and a stone. This body absorbed nothing. This body conducted. The lightning traveled through his hands and into the suit's power distribution network, and the suit screamed, 14 warning indicators becoming 22, the respiratory drive flagging a cascade risk. The cybernetic nerve interfaces spiking with feedback that arrived as pain at a level that made the 17 contact points feel like a memory of comfort. And he held it. He held it because the suit's vulnerability to Force lightning was not, any longer, the vulnerability Palpatine had designed. Callix had spent 19 years on the lightning vulnerability specifically. It had been the most complex problem in their bilateral work, not the mobility restrictions, not the excess weight, but the electromagnetic shielding of the primary life support systems, which required modifications so deeply embedded in the suit's base architecture that each one had to be introduced during legitimate maintenance windows as component replacements that fell within standard wear and replacement parameters. The shielding was not complete. It would never be complete. The suit's fundamental design compromised it too thoroughly for full remediation. But it was substantially improved. The cascade risk was real. The warning indicators were accurate. He had approximately 90 seconds before the respiratory drive failed. He used 40 of them. The Force came through him not as the dark side and not as the light side, but as both simultaneously. The cold, structural power he had been managing for 19 years, and the warmth that had lived in the crystal against his chest since a stone floor in the Imperial sub-basement, running together the way two rivers run together. Not canceling, but combining, producing something that had no Sith name and no Jedi name, and that Anakin did not waste time naming. He directed it at Palpatine. Not lightning, he had no gift for lightning in this body, had never had the gift for it in any body. What he directed was pressure. Telekinetic, force structural, the specific application of will against physical reality that he had been the most gifted practitioner of in recorded galactic history since the age of 9, and that 19 years of suit-narrowed force access had reduced, and that the bypass modifications had partially restored, and that the combined current running through him now amplified beyond anything the suit had previously permitted. Palpatine's force barrier held for 11 seconds. It was, objectively, an extraordinary barrier. 1,000 years of Sith refinement in its architecture, the accumulated technique of a lineage that had survived by being harder to kill than anything sent against it. 11 seconds against what Anakin was generating was not a failure of Palpatine's ability, it was a sealing of it. The barrier fractured. What followed was not dramatic. Anakin had found, across 19 years, that the things which mattered most were rarely dramatic in their execution. The most consequential modifications Callix had made had been indistinguishable from routine maintenance. The most consequential message he had ever sent had contained a set of coordinates, and the word confirmed. The most consequential conversation he had ever had taken place in a conference room where someone had offered him tea and he had declined because the mask did not permit it. Palpatine fell. The Force registered his absence the way it had registered the Death Star's absence. A shift in weight, a redistribution of pressure, something enormous becoming nothing and the surrounding space reorganizing to fill it. The cold, pressurized quality that had lived at the edge of Anakin's Force perception for 19 years retracted and was gone. The room was very quiet. The suit's warning indicators held at 22. The respiratory drive was in cascade risk. He had the suit's internal chronometer still functioning, still accurate, approximately 30 seconds before the drive failed entirely. He sat down on the floor of the Emperor's audience chamber. Not a collapse, a deliberate lowering, the prosthetics bending at their modified joints, the weight distributing to the stone floor with the specific heaviness of machinery that was doing its last work. He placed his right hand flat on the floor. The stone was cold. He could feel it through the suit's haptic system, amplified 40% above normal sensory threshold, which meant the cold arrived as significant cold, present and real, and the most purely physical sensation he had experienced in 19 years. He focused on it, the cold of the floor, the weight of the suit, the respirator cycling through its warning-flagged rhythm. Hiss, kuh, hiss. In the Force, very far away and then not far at all, distance was a physical property and the Force was not physical. A warm presence turned toward him, had been turning toward him, perhaps, since a listening post, on a small moon, since a data chip passed between two people who shared the same eyes. He felt Luke find him in the Force the way you feel a hand find yours in the dark, not seen, not explained, simply present and unmistakable. He had not planned for this. He had planned for 19 years with extraordinary thoroughness, and he had not planned for this because this was not a strategic variable. This was something else, something the room inside himself had no category for, and therefore had never tried to contain. He let it be what it was. I know, he thought toward it, without direction, without destination, the way he had thought toward the crystal on a stone floor a lifetime ago. I know who you are. I have always known. The warmth held him, did not answer in words, answered in the way the Force answered, in texture, in temperature, in the specific quality of presence that said, I know who you are too, and I am not leaving. The respiratory drive issued its final warning. Anakin looked up at the ceiling of the Emperor's audience chamber, which was the same stone as the floor, 4,000 years old, which had held the weight of the Republic, and was now holding the weight of the first minutes of whatever came after. The lightsaber was in his hand. He did not remember reaching for it. His thumb found the ignition. The blade was white, not the red of a bled crystal, not the blue of what he had been before. Mustafar, white, the color at the center of every other color. The color of a crystal that had been asked to carry darkness, and had carried it without becoming it. That had spent 19 years against a heartbeat learning the difference between containing a thing and being consumed by it. He looked at it for 3 seconds. Then, he set it on the floor beside him, carefully, the white blade casting its light across the stone. And he closed his eyes, and the Force held him the way it holds everything, completely, without condition, without requiring that he be anything other than exactly what he was. Behind the mask, in a face no one had seen in 19 years, something that had been held very carefully for a very long time, finally, quietly, let go. The respirator breathed its last mechanical breath. Hiss, kuh, and then the sound that had been the metronome of his existence since the first click of the mask ceased, and what replaced it was not silence. It was the Force, which had always been there, which had never stopped being there, which had been warm at the edges of everything he had built and protected and preserved across 19 years of deliberate, patient, costly, necessary darkness. The white blade burned on the stone floor of a room that smelled faintly like the end of something very old, and the beginning of everything else. Let us know what you'd like to see next, the end.